So at this point, we're pretty much done with our application. We've got everything working, all the memoization where we need it, the context to make things a little bit easier to handle, and all the state is working and optimized pretty well. But I wanted to go ahead and move forward and try a new library that's recently come out called Recoil. So Recoil is a state management library very specific to React. At the time of this recording, it's in version 0.10.0. So it's still kind of a beta, maybe I would consider. It definitely, has a lot of full features there, and you can totally use it in an app, even a production level app if you want to. My biggest, word of warning is that I think the docs are a little bit sparse at times. There's some incomplete examples and stuff, but for the most part, it's super cool. And what it is, I'm going to try and briefly explain it, but I know I'm going to do a terrible job. So just disclaimer, you should really go to the website and watch this video. Basically, Recoil creates a separate tree from your React tree, which mimics the DOM tree. So it creates a separate tree to hold all your state management stuff, and it's orthogonal, or kind of like next to, sideways. Those are all kind of the ways I think of that word, to your regular tree. So when you have a component over here, it can go look up this value, and also the component over here. In regular React, in this situation, if you had a state, value that was in both these components, you would have to lift it up to the nearest parent. And that's kind of what we did with context to make that a little bit easier. Or you have to, go about it by prop drilling or maybe composition. You can get away with something. But anyway, Recoil makes this stuff a lot easier. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to go to the app, and we're going to pull in from Recoil, something called the Recoil root. So you do have to have one, and really only one is what you want, of these roots at, probably the root of your application. Think of it kind of as a provider. This sets up that tree that you're going to be looking up and down. You probably want to put it at the lowest point at which you're actually using all this Recoil data, but for now, just putting it at the top kind of makes the most sense to me. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to actually start, making values in Recoil. So in Recoil, a value is called an atom. So if we're going to import from Recoil, we could import an atom. Now, another thing we can import is an atom family, and that's kind of a collection of atoms. Basically, an atom, they didn't really create this idea, but it's just kind of like an individual, value that holds something. And when that atom, updates, then everything subscribed to it will update as well. So we want an atom family because we want this for our items. We want this for all of the items that we're going to create. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this, we're going to call it items atom family. So const items atom family equals atom family. And I think it's easy to just go ahead and prefix it with what it actually is, or rather postfix it. You always need to pass in a key, and this is really just so that internally Recoil knows, how to find what it's looking for. And then a default, and in this case we can just do an empty object. It doesn't really matter. Then we'll export some helper functions. So the first one we want to export is use item. Oops, forgot the E. And then we'll return use Recoil value. And then we'll pass in the items atom family. But since this is an actual atoms family, it takes in an argument or a parameter, and that is the ID of what you're grabbing. So we're going to pass in item ID, and then we're going to pass that through. We're going to export a similar function called use set item, because we actually also want to be able to set this. We need to use set Recoil state, and those two are good. So let's go ahead and try and hook this up to the card and see what happens. So we'll go into the card, and we will say const item equals use item. And we need to pass in that ID. Did not auto import that, so let's make sure we get that in there. We got the item, and we're going to go ahead and say if the item does not exist, we'll return null. You probably actually want to throw an error and do some error handling and catching here and whatnot, but for the sake of time, we're just going to go ahead and throw null. And then we need to get everything from here out of this item, because that's where it's all going to live. We're not going to pass it down anymore. Cool, so those will all pass down. Of course, this broke everything, so let's go back up to cards. We're not passing all this down, so we can remove that. It's not very interesting anymore. We can remove all that. Now, again, this is not really working, so let's go ahead and comment this out just so we can get this working, and we'll return just a normal P with a key of the ID, and then the ID itself. And this will just display all the keys that we have. They're all these UUIDs. So now the next thing we want to do is we probably want to keep track of these item IDs somehow. And the way that I kind of think about this is it's very unintuitive, or not unintuitive, but pretty different than kind of what we did before. We're really going to separate our state out into as many atoms as we need instead of keeping them all as kind of one unified atom. But later I'll show you how to kind of combine them all, even though they still are separate atoms. So anyway, we're going to create an items IDs atom, and we're going to say atom, so we're going to import that. And then we will say key equals item IDs atom. And the default here is actually meaningful. It needs to be an array because we're going to put a bunch of strings in there. And then we're going to do some similar exports here, function use item IDs. And then this will return use recoil value. Oops, I don't want that value loadable. And we don't actually need to pass an item ID in here because every time we want to get the entire collection or entire atom, which is just the array. Similarly, we're going to export a use set item IDs, and then we'll use set recoil state, and we're good. Let's go ahead and delete this accidental import, and everything should update. So then how do we actually use this? Well, let's go back into those cards, and instead of getting the items, we'll say item IDs equals use item IDs. That's perfect. So we can go ahead and delete this, and we can use these. Now this is going to break because this is just an array. Now we're trying to destructure it, and we don't need to do that. We just need to pull it out. Now, of course, there's nothing in here. So let's go ahead and just add some simple examples. My name is Brooks. And it says my name is Brooks. And that's perfect. That's exactly what we want. It is displaying those, which is really great. So let's go ahead and get rid of that, and we'll turn this back here. Of course, this isn't going to work yet because we actually haven't hooked any of this stuff up, and it's not, we haven't added any way to add the items. So let's go ahead and create that functionality so we can get things going. So we're going to first add a use add item ID. That's kind of the first thing we want because we want to actually be able to add an ID itself. So that would be helpful. So export function use add item ID. And so, sorry, this will be a function. So what are we going to do here? We're going to need a couple of things to get this actually working. So the first thing that this is going to do is it's really going to return some sort of callback because we're going to call this and it'll actually add that item ID. So let's go ahead and get the item IDs, or the setter rather. So use set item IDs. And then from there, what we want to do is we're going to call set item IDs, and we can actually use immer inside of this. And it's a very similar thing to where as the use state, the set state function, how when you have a set state, you can provide a callback. I didn't mean for that to autocomplete. And you can take the previous value of the state and manipulate it in any way you want, and then return that, and that will be the new state. So similarly, we can do that here. If we wrap it with produce from immer, we can just take the draft itself. So we'll take that draft, and then we'll say if the draft does not include a new ID, and where does this new ID come in from? Well, we need to pass it in here. So if it does not already include that, then we'll go ahead and push it. There we go. We've got our use add item ID. But of course, we don't just want to add the ID, we want to add the entire atom. So below this, let's do export function use add item. And then again, we're going to return a function here. And here, we're not actually going to pass down the ID. We're going to auto-generate that. And how do we do that? Well, let's see, use add item. So I'm looking it up in my notes here, just because this is probably one of the more complicated functions we have just to get everything kind of to play nice. And again, we're going to show kind of some better ways to clean up this stuff and make it a little bit more ergonomic and something like we're used to. So first we want to get a newest item, and we'll do create new item. This comes from our fake data creator, and this actually takes in the items length, so the current length of however many items there are. So we'll take the item IDs.length, which means that we need to do const item IDs equals use item IDs, and that will give us that use item IDs. For some reason, it's not happy about that. So let's see. This is because I have to pull this up here. Sorry, I was putting it inside of this function, and React definitely does not like that. So I need it outside of there. We'll use those, get that link, that'll get the newest item. And then what do we want to do with that? Well, we want to use this exact thing that we just created. So we'll do const add item ID equals use add item ID. And so in this case, it does take that newest item ID. And we're good, but we created an item and we've now just kind of lost it. We only logged the actual ID itself, which definitely is not enough. So what we want to do here is we actually want to keep track of it. And the best way to do that is with some state. We're in a hook, so we can go ahead and use state. So we'll say const new item, set new item equals use state, and we'll go ahead and set it to null. And this needs to import, of course, from React. So we'll go ahead and set it to null, and then we'll say set the new item to that newest item. And how are we actually going to update this? Well, we need const, we're going to do set item, use set item. Oops, set item. And then if you remember, when we created this use set item, it actually takes in an item ID. And how do we get that item ID? Well, we take it from new item dot ID. But of course, if this is null, this is going to break. So we put a question mark in front of it. And this says that, hey, if you have the value of ID, let's go ahead and use it. So now what do we do? Well, we want to say, okay, we've got this setter, but we actually want to update it. And so we need to call for a use effect here to kind of synchronize these things. Again, this is a little bit more complicated than I would like it to be, but I think this is actually the easiest way to get it to start working without learning some more advanced features of Recoil. So we got our use effect, and we're going to say if the new item does not equal null. So in this case, we're not going to do anything. We would actually just skip over. So only when there's actually a new item, what we're going to do is we're going to say set the item first to that new item, and then set the new item to null. So we know that it's, it's reset. This internal state is good and clear. And then we'll add these dependencies so that this will always update. Otherwise, we would get some stale data, and that would not be good. Great. So we got our use add item, and it implements that use add items IDs. Let's go into our controls, because this is where we can actually add that item. And we will go ahead and say const add item equals use add item. And then of course this is mad because it's kind of named twice, and we got it here. And if we do, well, that broke, of course, because we're still calling the dispatch. That it does not know, that dispatch that we created earlier does not know how to handle that. So we just need to pass in add item. That function is already created for us. We'll click add item, and there we go. It added the items, which is really, really great. This is all working exactly like we want it to. So what's the next kind of logical step? Well, I think removing an item. That seems pretty easy to me. And in fact, it actually is a lot easier than what we just created. So we're going to do export function, use remove item. And in this case, we just need to get the item IDs. And what we're going to do is we're going to return a function that calls, this should be, set item IDs, and then use set item IDs. And we'll pass in a produce from Emmer, and then we'll take that draft. And with that draft, we want to just pop the last one. That's all that our remove function does. It just removes the last thing. And to avoid, if we just did this, we would pop and it would return the index of whatever we popped, or maybe it's the value, I don't actually remember. So we can, to keep this in line, we can just pass void, and this means that this will be undefined. And if produce receives undefined back, then it assumes that, oh, you're just mutating the draft and you're using that. So that's exactly what we'll do. So we got this use remove items. Of course, we need to go back into the controls and actually add that functionality. So we'll say remove item. Again, we got to delete it from the import, and we don't want to call with dispatch. We'll just take it out and replace it. So this is not happy because I don't think we actually imported it, and there we go. Let's go over here. We can add these items, and then we can remove them, and it works exactly like we want. This is really, really great. Everything is working exactly like we want. The only problem now, of course, is we can't actually, add these checks. And of course, we haven't implemented these things, but we'll get to those in a second. So let's add the toggling option. We're going to go back into app state one more time, and we're going to add a function called export function, use toggle choice. So we'll say we want a couple of things here. We want, again, looking at my notes, because there's a couple of things that need to be passed in. Of course, we need the item ID. That's what I was forgetting. Because if you remember, we're using that items atom family, and so you always have to pull out the specific ID to get the right thing there. So we got use toggle choice, and then we're gonna need set item. We can use set item, and then pass in the item ID. So we got the set item, which is good, and we'll return a function here. And what do we need with this function? Well, if we remember, we had an option key. We've already passed an item ID. The other thing was we need that option key to say, React View, whatever, however these are in that object that's been created. And then we'll say set item, and then produce draft. This should just be feel pretty, standard boilerplate at this point. Say option equals draft dot options. Oops. And then option key. And then with that, we're going to say option.value, and since this is just a toggle, it's going to equal the opposite of the option.value. If we wanted to, we could pass in that value, but we're just doing the opposite. That's kind of what we've been doing throughout this course, so we'll keep it consistent. And we can go into the checklist. We can delete that. We can say const toggle choice equals use toggle choice. Now we want to get rid of these guys and replace it with what we just grabbed. And again, we do not need a dispatch. But here we do need to keep this in line because we need to pass in that key, which is really that option key that I was talking about. Now we can add the item. We can click lines, and something else broke. So let's see what it's upset about. It said cannot read property reactive undefined. So let's go into this and see. Oh, what did we do here? So we got the set item from use set item, took in that item ID. So that was the problem. Of course, when we called this, we actually have to pass in that ID. So that's the trick with those atom families. You have to pass that ID now. If we click lines, bears, it all works, which is super cool. This is all, really just refactoring to use Recoil at this point. We didn't really have to do any of that prop drilling. We didn't really have to set up a context or anything. We could just set up these atoms, which in its own way, I think is just incredibly simple and kind of a really nice API once you start getting used to it.